Today we're joined by Dr. Merlin Monzel from the University of Bonn to discuss his groundbreaking research on anxiety treatments for aphantasia. Dr. Monzel's latest study examines a fascinating question. Can imaginal exposure therapy, a common technique for treating anxiety and phobias, be effective for people with aphantasia? This has significant implications for therapy and treatment approaches for the estimated 4% of the population who, like me, cannot generate mental pictures. In this presentation, Dr. Monzel will walk us through his research, explain how people with aphantasia respond to imagery-based therapeutic techniques, and what this means for clinical practice. Stay tuned for some surprising findings that could change how we think about mental health treatment for those with aphantasia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Merlin Monzel, for those who don't know me yet. I'm a psychologist and researcher at the University of Bonn, and I have done several talks for the Aphantasia Network in the past, and I'm happy to be here again, especially since our new results are practically relevant, I would think, and maybe will help some of you to understand themselves better and maybe to get better treatment in therapy. My presentation will be about mental imagery-based therapeutic techniques and their effectiveness for those with aphantasia. And the presentation is also called Rethinking Anxiety Treatment for Diverse Minds. The talk is based mainly on our latest publication, Stage 2 registered report. Propositional thought is sufficient for imaginal extinction as shown by contrasting participants with aphantasia, simulated aphantasia, and controls. Sounds pretty complicated, but I will explain it in full detail. If you want more statistical values, which I have omitted from this presentation, I would refer you to this paper, since I want to keep this talk as understandable to laymen as possible, but feel free to read it afterwards. I would like to start with a very common situation in therapy where patient X had an unpleasant encounter with a dog. The dog was barking loudly and maybe the dog even attacked patient X. Since then, the patient has an incredible fear of dogs, no matter how small or big the dog is, or whether it actually poses a threat. In therapy, the therapist does something which is actually pretty common, and he asks the patient to ignore his fear of dogs and to go in the park, to pet some dogs and to play with dogs. And this is something called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy means facing a feared object, situation, or activity to learn that a fear stimulus is not directly associated with threat. With this, patient X could learn that most dogs are actually pretty harmless, but he has to give it a try. Unfortunately, patient X is too scared and is not able to do so. Our therapist changes his strategy, and he asks the patient to imagine playing with the dog instead. This patient is not an aphantasic and thus he can do this and imagines a dog, imagines playing with the dog, imagines petting the dog. This is something called imaginal exposure, and this is done pretty often when exposure in reality is not possible, for example, due to ethical, financial, or practical reasons. For example, confronting someone with his fear of flying would be quite expensive in the long run because we have to buy many flight tickets, or confronting someone with a war trauma would be highly unethical because we cannot send someone in a war zone. This is impossible for us. So imaginary exposure is just something we can do when exposure in reality is not possible. The mechanism behind exposure therapy is quite simple. Before exposure, we have the situation that our neutral stimulus, in this case the dog, is highly associated with danger or threat, represented by this strong overlap between the two circles, and thus originally neutral stimulus becomes a fear stimulus. We have an association that each dog is dangerous. During exposure therapy, this association is extinguished because our patient can learn that actually not all dogs are dangerous and that in reality this overlap is pretty small. After the exposure therapy, the patient would have learned that there are some dogs that are dangerous, but most dogs are harmless, and this corrective experience can alleviate the fear. Why do we need therapy for this? This is because in reality, these corrective experiences are often prevented by escape behavior. For example, patient X could see a dog in the park that is barking, and before he can make the corrective experience that the dog will not attack him, he runs away and thus never makes the experience that the dog would like to play with him. For our study, however, the most important research question was, is mental imagery actually necessary for imaginal exposure to occur or imaginal extinction to occur? Or in other words, can imaginal extinction be done without mental imagery? To investigate this, we applied a method called imaginal extinction, which is an experimental analog of imaginal exposure, in which a fear association is first established using something called differential fear conditioning and then extinguished afterwards. This procedure is very important for us because we have to be sure that the fear association of each participant in our study, of each participant group, is the same, as strong as for the other groups. So what have we done? In the first phase, the acquisition phase, our participants are presented with pictures of two different objects. We have chosen a Christmas bauble and a basket of bananas because these were used in a past study before. And one of these pictures is always paired with a painful electric shock represented by this lightning bolt here. For example, each time when a participant sees the Christmas bauble, they get a shock. And so over the course of time, they associate the Christmas bauble with the pain of the electric shock, and the originally neutral stimulus of a Christmas bauble becomes a fear stimulus. After this fear association is established, we go to the next phase, the imaginal extinction phase. And in this phase, our participants are not presented with pictures anymore. Instead, they get an audio cue, for example, Christmas bauble, and are then asked to imagine the picture of the Christmas bauble in as much detail as possible. However, this time, this imagined picture is not paired with a painful electric shock. The association between the shock and the picture of the Christmas bauble should be extinguished. Then, after this phase is done, there's a third phase, the so-called reinstatement phase. And in this phase, our participants are delivered two painful electric shocks in the beginning to reinstate the fear memory that was extinguished in the last phase. So the brain is remembered, oh, there was something like pain in the phases before, maybe I should be more prepared again. So the fear memory is reinstated, and afterwards they are presented with the pictures of both objects, again not paired with any electric shocks, so the fear memory can be extinguished for another time. During all of these three phases, we always measure the skin conductance level of all participants, which is a measure of physiological fear. What does this mean? If we are afraid of something, we start to sweat. And when we sweat, our skin conductance level increases. So an increased level of skin conductance corresponds to fear, physiological fear, which is measurable within our body response. Moreover, we asked our participants how much fear they did experience during the last part of the experiment to assess the more subjective component of fear, whether they felt anxious or not. So both measures are pretty important and do not always correspond to each other. We can have high physiological fear but low subjective fear and vice versa. We measured these two values in three groups, actually. We had an Aphantasia group, a control group, and something we call a simulated Aphantasia group. The simulated Aphantasia group was instructed to look into a bright light during the imaginal extinction phase, since the bright light is expected to overstimulate the visual neurons so that no visual imagery can be generated. So these normal visualizers should become aphantasic. As you can hear on the right side of the slide, I can show it here, yes. The Aphantasics had actually less vividness of visual imagery as self-reported with the vividness of visual imagery questionnaires. The Aphantasics did differ from the controls in the simulated Aphantasics. Importantly, the same effect was found with a task called binocular rivalry task, which is a more indirect measure of mental imagery capacity, which is not based on self-reports, we can exclude the possibility that Aphantasics just think that they lack mental imagery. You can also see here that the controls and the simulated Aphantasics did not differ in their mental imagery capacities. This is because our measurements were applied before the bright light was turned on, because we wanted to see whether normally our simulated Aphantasics would have mental imagery. So important right now is only that Aphantasics had less mental imagery than our control groups. Now we can look into the data to see how this influences our fear conditioning and imaginal extinction procedure. We can start with the fear acquisition phase. At the beginning of the fear acquisition phase, the difference in skin conductance level between the fear stimulus, also called CS+, and the neutral stimulus, also called CS-, is rather low. There is a difference because we have been to several trials together, so there were some shocks before, but the difference is actually pretty small in the beginning. And over the course of the fear acquisition, the participants receive more and more shocks when the CS+ is delivered, so that they learn, okay, the CS+ is actually dangerous, but the CS- is not dangerous, so the fear response for the CS- declines, while the fear response for the CS+ stays high, and the difference becomes bigger. And this is important that this difference becomes bigger in the end, because this established that the fear acquisition was actually successful. And importantly, this was also true for Aphantasics and simulated Aphantasics. As you can see in all three figures, the difference was small in the beginning and larger in the end of the fear acquisition procedure. So we know that the extent of fear was the same for all three groups, and there are no differences that could influence how the fear is extinguished afterwards. Now let's look at the most important part of our experiment, the imaginal fear extinction part. As you can see here, the difference between the fear response with regard to the CS+ and with regard to the CS- was high in the beginning, because our participants had learned that the CS+ is dangerous because it was always paired with an electric shock, but they had not learned the same for the CS-. However, during the imaginal extinction phase, they do not receive any shocks anymore, and so they learn that the association between the CS+ and the electric shock is overestimated. The fear declines, and in the end of the paradigm, there's no difference between the fear stimulus and the neutral stimulus. So the fear stimulus became neutral again. The fear extinction was successful. And this was true for controls. This is what we would expect, because this is also the mechanism in exposure therapy. Importantly, what are the results for our Aphantasics? As you can see here, these were essentially the same results. You can see in the beginning, the fear association between the CS+ and the electric shock was high, leading to high differences between the two stimuli. But in the end, the fear extinction procedure was successful, leading to no differences for the fear stimulus and the neutral stimulus. And this is pretty important, because this data hints that mental imagery is not important for imaginal extinction to occur. We can also look at the fear reinstatement phase. It's pretty much the same results. We have small but significant differences in the beginning, because the fear was reinstated in our participants. But after being presented with the pictures again, without any electric shocks, they learn that there's no association anymore between electric shocks and the stimuli, and the difference disappears. Also, this was true for Aphantasics and simulated. We can also look at the data for the subjective fear experience, and here we can see that Aphantasics reported less subjective fear than controls and simulated Aphantasics, whereas the difference between controls and simulated Aphantasics was not meaningful at all. And this is pretty interesting, because we have seen that the physiological fear response from Aphantasics was the same as for the other two groups, but subjectively they think they have less fear of the stimuli. It's less distressing for them to perform this fear acquisition procedure. Let's summarize our most important results. First, Fear extinction and fear reinstatement could be found in aphantasics and non-aphantasics. Thus, imaginal exposure might be effective without mental imagery. Second, subjective fear was lower for aphantasics compared to controls. Thus, non-imagery based exposure might be less distressing than imagery-based therapeutic techniques, even for non-aphantasics. So when the effectiveness of non-imagery-based strategies and imagery-based techniques is the same, we should always use the non-imagery-based techniques because they are less distressing, and thus our participants will feel better in the therapy session and are more likely to complete the therapy without quitting halfway. Importantly, there are some weaknesses in our research design that have to be mentioned. First, our memory consolidation period was too small. Normally, we would wait overnight for the free memory to consolidate because consolidation is often done during our sleep. However, since aphantasia is a pretty rare condition and our aphantasics had to travel a long way to come to our lab, we didn't want to ask them to stay overnight in a hotel. This would be expensive, this would be time consuming. And so we decided to reduce the memory consolidation period to only 1 hour. So between each experimental phase, there was only 1 hour. And we cannot actually be sure that the same results would show when the memory consolidation period was longer. This is something for future research to investigate. Second, we only found these results in our lab. However, our results have to be validated in real clinical practice so that we can actually say that exposure also functions within aphantasics. I would love to do this, but we need more contact to practitioners in this case, or to patients who have maybe experience with this kind of therapy in the field. And last, we had no validation of the simulated aphantasia group during the imaginal extinction period because we could not ask them to look into the bright light, imagine, and conduct a imaginal extinction procedure at the same time. So we have no data from this period and do not know whether the bright light actually led to less mental imagery. However, this is only a small point of criticism because our main comparison was between controls and aphantasics. This was only an add-on. On the other hand, there were also some important strengths of our research design. First, differences in imagery strength could be ensured not only via self-report, but also via behavioral responses in the binocular rivalry task, which makes our results a little bit more independent of metacognitive failures or introspection errors. Second, we were able to ensure that fear acquisition actually took place, because normally we would not know how strong the association of fear is in a patient, but with our fear acquisition paradigm, we could be very sure that in each group the fear association was the same extent, and that it was actually there. This was pretty important for our experimental control. Last, we are glad that we assessed physiological and subjective measures of fear, because these measures dissociated in our paradigm and were actually not the same. And this is really important to look into fear at those different levels, which we have done here. So what are the take-home messages of our study? In principle, imaginal exposure might be effective even for aphantasics. However, and this is something I have to say, aphantasics may be more unmotivated to comply with imagery instructions. For example, when the therapist says, please imagine playing with a dog, what does imagine even mean for those aphantasics? Thus, the aphantasics could just decide not to comply, and then our therapy will not be effective at all. And it's important that the compliance of the aphantasics can be maintained. So I would suggest, but we have not tested, this would just be by implication, we would suggest that therapists should use proper language when working with aphantasics. For example, using alternative terms such as describe playing with a dog in as much detail as possible, or think about playing with a dog, or write down a story with a dog in as much detail as possible, something with which aphantasics can identify. And with this small adjustments in language, imagery-based therapeutic techniques might be more accessible to aphantasics and maybe even the same effective. For example, as you can see on the slide, our therapist has changed its approach to please describe the dog as detailed as possible, and patient X can actually do this. He describes a dog that is an animal with 4 legs, sharp teeth, it barks, it has brown paws or something like this. And over time, the brain of our patient will learn that the concept of a dog or the description of a dog is not associated with direct danger, and then he will maybe less scared and will agree to meet up with a dog. Then in vivo or reality exposure will take place, which is great because this is a little bit more effective. And then our patient will learn, okay, dogs can be harmful, but most dogs aren't harmful, and these are some cues that I can look into to not generalize my fear to all dogs. And then maybe after some weeks or months, imaginal exposure and then in vivo exposure will be successful, and our patient will have less fear of dogs. This was my presentation. I thank you very much for the attention. When you are interested in taking part in our Aphantasia studies, please register in our participant pool via this QR code or via this link. But before you do this, I'm happy to answer any questions. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Great, Merlin. Thank you for that presentation. And for anyone who's listening along live, feel free, if you have any questions for Merlin, to add them in the chat, and we'll get to them later. I want to jump in, though, with a little bit of a summary, if I understand correctly. Correct me maybe where I miss it. It seems like there's two things. One is that imaginal exposure actually works for aphantasics, but some of the language maybe has to be altered so that they don't disengage because they don't know what you mean when they say to imagine a dog. And so by talking through some of the concepts, that rationalization, that thinking about it, still actually helps them get over some of the fear they might have associated.
Yeah, this would pretty much be our interpretation of our results. We had some situations in the lab where aphantasics said to us during the imaginal extinction period, what do you mean by imagine the Christmas bauble? I cannot imagine. And then we instructed them, yeah, do what you would normally do when someone asks you to imagine, maybe describe it in your head, maybe just think about the concept. And when they were encouraged to do so, they did know what they had to do and did not abort the experiment at all.
Interesting. Why do you think, so we saw a difference between the physiological fear response and the subjective reporting of fear on the aphantasic group. That's really interesting. Why do you think that is?
This is actually something which is observed pretty often in people with alexithymia. This is a decoupling of physiological arousal and subjective experience. And one of our hypotheses is that aphantasics might be more alexithymic, have more of this decoupling. And we have also looked into this in another study and found associations between aphantasia and alexithymia. So this could explain this pattern in our data.
And that concludes the public portion of our presentation with Dr. Monzel. We'll now transition to our member-only Q&A section, where we continue the conversation. In the next section, Merlin and I discuss the surprising relationship between aphantasia and alexithymia, a condition that affects our emotional awareness. We discuss why aphantasics might physiologically react to fear, while subjectively feel less afraid, and whether aphantasia might actually protect against certain trauma responses. We discuss the visual impedance effect, a cognitive advantage aphantasics may have when solving problems, and Dr. Monzel's intriguing finding that having weak mental imagery might actually be more challenging than having none at all. If you found this presentation valuable, consider joining the Aphantasia Network to access the full Q&A and our library of exclusive research interviews, community discussions, and resources. Sign up using the link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next